At 7:40 p.m. on a quiet evening in May 1960, along the dusty suburban streets of San Fernando on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, a thin man in a trench coat stepped off the Route 203 bus. For 15 years he had lived under the false identity of Ricardo Klement, believing himself invisible to the world that hunted him. He was Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust and one of history's most wanted war criminals. What happened in the next 60 seconds would culminate one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the 20th century, hold a Nazi war criminal accountable, and send shockwaves through the international community that are still felt to this day. But just how did the man who orchestrated the logistics of genocide disappear into suburban obscurity? Who were the Holocaust survivors who refused to let him hide, and the Israeli agents who risked everything to bring him to justice? In this video, the first of two, using declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and accounts from those who tracked him down, we'll explore the hunt for Adolf Eichmann. To understand the magnitude of this operation, we must first understand the man they were hunting. Adolf Eichmann was born in 1906 in Solingen, Germany, but raised in Austria. Unlike the rabid ideologues and street fighters who formed the Nazi Party's early core, Eichmann was something of far more sinister. A bureaucrat with a talent for organisation and an absence of conscience. He joined the SS in 1932 and rose rapidly through the Nazi hierarchy, not through violence or passionate speeches, but through meticulous administration. When the Nazi regime turned its genocidal focus toward Europe's Jewish population, Eichmann found his calling as head of Jewish affairs in the Gestapo. Let's zoom down into this affluent Berlin suburb to explore one of history's most infamous addresses, Am Großen Wannsee 56-58. From satellite view, this elegant lakeside villa appears deceptively peaceful, surrounded by trees and overlooking the pristine waters of Lake Wannsee. But on the 20th of January 1942, this mansion became the site where the systematic murder of European Jewry was formalised into official Nazi policy. The villa, clearly visible today with its distinctive neoclassical architecture and manicured grounds, hosted what would become known as the Wannsee Conference. It was right here that 15 Nazi officials gathered for what they called a coordination meeting. Amongst them sat SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, not as a decision maker, but as the meeting's organiser and recorder. After just 90 minutes, the fate of millions of people had been decided. Chillingly, the lunch that followed lasted 2 hours. Unlike the infamous Nazi leaders whose faces dominated propaganda films and newspaper headlines, Adolf Eichmann remained virtually unknown to the public during the Second World War. Eichmann's contribution to the Holocaust was not that of a sadistic killer or fanatical ideologue, but something far more chilling. He was the chief logistical coordinator of genocide. As head of the Jewish affairs section of the Gestapo, Eichmann transformed the Nazi vision of the final solution from abstract policy into horrifyingly efficient reality. His expertise lay not in violence but in transportation, the mundane but critical task of moving millions of people from their homes to ghettos and ultimately to extermination camps. His office became the central hub for what the Nazis euphemistically called resettlement actions, a term that Eichmann helped popularise to disguise the true nature of mass murder. He maintained detailed records of Jewish populations in every occupied territory, creating what amounted to an inventory for extermination that allowed the Nazi regime to target communities across an entire continent systematically. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, Eichmann, like many others, was captured and ultimately detained in an American-run internment camp for SS personnel. Hidden amongst thousands of prisoners, he successfully posed as Otto Eichmann, just another low-level German soldier lost in the chaos of post-war Europe. But in 1946, Eichmann made his move. Traversing Allied-occupied Germany, he first went to ground in the small Bavarian town of Cham, with a population of just 15,000 nestled in rolling hills near the Czech border. From Cham, Eichmann embarked on a remarkable 600-kilometre journey through a war-shattered Germany. Following what would have been the main roadways of 1946, today's A6 and A7 motorways, he travelled northwest through a landscape of bombed cities and Allied checkpoints. This distance, which takes about 6 hours to drive today, would have required weeks of careful movement for a fugitive in post-war Germany. His destination was one of Germany's most remote regions, Lüneburg Heath in Lower Saxony. Eichmann found his perfect hiding place, the tiny village of Alten Salzkoth, so small it barely registers on most maps. Located approximately 15 kilometers south of the town of Celle, this farming community of fewer than 200 residents provided ideal cover for a man seeking invisibility. While Eichmann chopped wood in rural Lower Saxony, the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal was unfolding just 300 kilometers to the south. Whilst former colleagues, including Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Höss, were naming him directly as a central figure in the Holocaust for the entire world to see, he remained invisible in his northern German hideout. In 1948, while still hiding in Lower Saxony, Eichmann began planning his final escape, securing a landing permit for Argentina through the Rat Lines, Catholic church networks that smuggled Nazi fugitives to South America. Whilst that story is not one we'll cover in great detail in this video, it is nevertheless a fascinating one. And if you'd like to know more about post-war links between Nazi fugitives, South America and the Vatican, be sure to check out the Untitled History podcast, where recently our host Gareth Edwards took a deep dive into that very subject. You can catch it completely free right here on YouTube or wherever you get your pods. Prominent in that story is Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric and Nazi sympathizer in Rome, facilitated false identification papers under the name Ricardo Klement, along with a Red Cross humanitarian passport. And so, on the 17th of June 1950, from the same ancient harbour that once launched Christopher Columbus toward the New World, Adolf Eichmann boarded the Giovanni Sea, bound for Argentina. 27 days later, on the 14th of July 1950, he arrived in Buenos Aires as Ricardo Klement, ready to begin a new life. Eichmann's first destination was Tucumán province, approximately 1,100 kilometers northwest of Buenos Aires. Zooming in on this mountainous region near the Andes foothills, we find a landscape of sugar plantations and small industrial towns, far from the international scrutiny focused on Argentina's capital. In 1952, Eichmann made a crucial decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He sent for his wife Vera and their 3 sons. His family's escape from Europe followed a similar pattern to his own, utilising the same rat lines network that had smuggled him to safety. By 1953, the reunited Eichmann family had moved to Buenos Aires proper, settling into the anonymous mass of European migrants who had flooded Argentina after the war. Over the next several years, with this exact work permit, Eichmann held a series of unremarkable jobs, eventually though finding employment at Mercedes-Benz Argentina. The company's main facility, located in the suburb of González Catán, about 30 kilometers southwest of central Buenos Aires, is clearly visible today as a large industrial complex surrounded by working-class neighbourhoods. Here, Eichmann and his family settled into a routine and began to build a new life in Argentina, blending into the sizable German immigrant population in the bustling city. Another member of that same community was Lothar Hermann, a Holocaust survivor who had had a very different war, losing both his sight and his family to Nazi persecution. Now, in Buenos Aires, he lived quietly with his daughter Sylvia, trying to rebuild a life shattered by genocide. By 1956, Sylvia had begun dating a young man who went by the name of Klaus Eichmann, though he told her to call him Nick. Nick was boastful in the way young men often are, but his boasts were different. He spoke proudly of his father's important role during the war, made casual anti-Semitic remarks, and seemed to relish shocking people with stories about what his family had done to Jews. For most teenagers, such talk might have been dismissed as empty bragging, but Sylvia Hermann was the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. She understood the weight of those words. When she told her father about Nick's disturbing comments, Lothar Hermann's blood ran cold. The name Eichmann was not unknown to him. It was seared into the memory of every Holocaust survivor as being to one of the architects of their destruction. Hermann began his own quiet investigation. Through careful questioning and observation, he became convinced that Nick's father was not just any former Nazi, he was Adolf Eichmann himself. But Hermann faced a dilemma. Argentina's authorities had shown little interest in pursuing Nazi war criminals. The local German community was protective of its own. And Hermann was a blind man with no official standing and little influence. So instead, he wrote a letter to Fritz Bauer, a well-known German prosecutor who had shown unusual dedication in pursuing war crimes cases. Bauer read Hermann's account with growing excitement and alarm. But he faced his own problem. He didn't trust West Germany's judiciary to handle such a sensitive case properly. Too many former Nazis remained in positions of authority. Instead, Bauer made an unprecedented decision. He contacted Israeli intelligence directly, passing along Hermann's information and requesting they investigate. That letter, once it reached Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, would set in motion one of the most audacious operations in intelligence history. Their initial reaction to Hermann's letter was skepticism. Could the notorious Adolf Eichmann really be living quietly in suburban Buenos Aires? Eventually, in 1959, they dispatched an advance team to Argentina to investigate. What they would find would exceed their most optimistic hopes. The following excerpt comes directly from Eichmann in My Hands, the memoir of Peter Malkin, a Mossad agent who formed part of that early team tasked with identifying the home and the man who lived in it. Aaron eased the car off the main road onto a side street, then made a sharp turn onto a narrow dirt path, weaving his way between the large puddles. It was a poor area, even more so than the photos had indicated. The houses were small and ramshackle, few had electricity. "We're parallel to Garibaldi Street," spoke up Aaron. We drove a bit farther, slowly wheeled back onto a wider street, and then Aaron slammed on the brakes. Before us in the darkness, someone was holding up a red torch. Two figures approached the car. Straining, we could make out that both were armed with pistols and truncheons. We were not armed. Soldiers. They were very young and probably far more nervous than we were. So we got out into the rain and, Aaron in the lead, started slogging our way through the thick mud and driving rain. Never had I got so thoroughly drenched so quickly. My ridiculous suit was plastered to my body and my shoes began to squeak. The only saving grace, I reflected miserably, was that our footprints would be washed away. After an interminable 10 minutes, we made it to the base of a steep hill. Then, on hands and knees, we struggled our way to the top. Aaron was a genius. We were on the railroad embankment we had noted on the charts. Directly beneath us lay another set of railroad tracks, and just beyond, as in a fairy tale, was spread out the view in which we'd become so familiar through the pictures. Off to the left lay Route 202, still heavy with traffic, and directly before us stood the Klement home. Kneeling on the wooden ties, we rested our elbows on the cold tracks. The only one of us dressed appropriately, Aaron, produced 2 pairs of high-powered Zeiss binoculars from the pocket of his heavy overcoat. The house was about 50 yards away. I stared through one of the 2 front windows, shutters ajar and framed by white curtains, into the dim interior lit by a kerosene lamp. I could make out a table and some chairs and a door leading into a back room. Then, suddenly, a bright lit bus detached itself from the highway traffic and squealed to a stop. My watch read 7:35. As the bus pulled away, 2 figures could be seen at the curb. They crossed the road side by side. One was a woman, bundled up against the wet and cold. The other, a man in hat and light trench coat, seemed almost oblivious to it. "That's him," hissed Aaron. On the other side of the road, the 2 of them separated, the man turning onto Garibaldi Street. My hand was numb, but I held tightly to the glasses. It was too dark to make out his features, only that he wore heavily rimmed glasses. But there was this purposeful, measured walk, the erect head, the level gaze. Instantly, the doubt began to melt away. Let's take a moment to understand exactly how this identification unfolded and trace the footsteps of the agent, using the same photographic evidence that convinced Mossad to risk everything on Operation Finale. Buenos Aires has transformed dramatically since the 1950s, but using satellite imagery and historical photographs, we can piece together precisely what Israeli agents saw through their camera lenses. The surveillance team's key observation post was located in an elevated position along the railway embankment south of Garibaldi Street in the Valles suburb of Buenos Aires. They captured a crucial surveillance photograph that would become evident in one of history's most important intelligence operations. In the black and white image, you can clearly see the modest houses lining the sparsely populated Garibaldi Street, the small river running parallel to the railway, and the distinctive bridge crossing to the left of the frame. Now if we switch to street view and position ourselves at the same location today, the transformation is remarkable. The open field is now filled with buildings and streets are paved and well lit, but the fundamental geography remains unchanged. The same river flows in its concrete channel, the railway embankment provides the same elevated view, and that distinctive bridge still spans the waterway exactly where it appeared in the Mossad surveillance photos. Despite the change in address from 14 to 6061, these photos confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt that 6061, this modest concrete home, was indeed their target. Now that the team had definitively identified the house, the next question was far more critical. Was Ricardo Klement actually Adolf Eichmann? Mossad headquarters would not approve such a risky international kidnapping operation without absolute certainty. The stakes were enormous. If they captured the wrong man, or worse, were discovered by the authorities, it would become a diplomatic catastrophe that could destroy Israel's relationships with Latin America. The breakthrough came when surveillance agents managed to approach the house directly and capture close-up photographs of their target. They used this surveillance truck to approach the home without arousing suspicion. Eventually, the agents were even bold enough to approach Eichmann and engage him in conversation while secretly photographing him. Let's examine this evidence exactly as the Mossad analysis team would have done in 1960. On the left, we have the exact wartime photographs of SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann that Mossad used for comparison. It was taken during his years coordinating the deportation machinery of the Holocaust. The image shows a thin-faced man with prominent ears, a distinctive nose, and deep-set eyes. Note the particular shape of his skull, the way his hairline receded, and the angular structure of his jaw. On the right, we have the surveillance photographs captured by the Mossad team outside his home in Garibaldi Street. Despite 15 years of aging, despite the weight loss from manual labour, despite the absence of his SS uniform, the facial structure is unmistakable. The same prominent ears, the same angular jawline, the same distinctive nose. Even the way he carried himself, that stiff military bearing that had characterized his appearance in Nazi headquarters, remained unchanged in suburban Buenos Aires. The photographic analysis was exhaustive and the conclusions were beyond a doubt. The man Ricardo Klement, living on 14 Garibaldi Street in San Fernando, was actually Adolf Eichmann, the organizer of the final solution. So with their target identified, now a new question arose: what to do about it? Eichmann was after all a foreign national living in a country which is known as a haven for Nazi war criminals, one which is far more likely to warn him than extradite him. And so, after much deliberation, a course of action was agreed upon, to lie in wait, capture and then smuggle him out of the country to finally face justice. That plan, which took the name Operation Finale, was set in motion.